Have you ever noticed that your appetite changes with your period or with your hormones? And have you ever wondered what's going on there? So it was an appetite change that clued this week's guest into that maybe something wasn't quite right. My guest this week is Sarah Dosanjh, who is a binge eating coach. It's also a story session about going into menopause very early in her late 20s and kind of grappling with all of these changes that were happening that really led into a challenging period in her life with her relationship with food, which led to a big career change. And we're going to hear all about it. So thanks so much to Sarah for joining me. I would love to hear from people. Have you noticed that your appetite changes with your period? Have you noticed that if you're still having a cycle, that there are times when you feel really hungry or not hungry at all? Does that impact how you notice and feel satisfaction? I think that these are important questions, and I'd love to hear from you. Hi, Sarah. Welcome to the Midlife Feast.
Hi, Jen. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to be digging into your story of going into premature ovarian insufficiency, or otherwise known as very early menopause, and how that kind of experience and the symptoms that you were having led you to experience kind of binge eating and led to this work that you're doing. But I'd love to invite you just to kind of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Of course. So I'm Sarah. I'm currently 42. I've been a psychotherapist for about 6 years now, and prior to that, I was a police officer for 16 years. And so I made the career change, started studying, 11, 12 years ago, and we'll probably get to it today, but what I went through with my hormones and all of this, I think was a catalyst for me doing what I do now. So I now specialize in working with people who struggle with binge eating.
Okay. And I love the catalyst part, because I think a lot of our lived experiences do really kind of inform what we do with our time and our work, and how we, if we choose to help others, how we do that. But just for anybody who's listening, I wanted to introduce a little bit before we get started this idea of what we mean by early menopause. So the average age of menopause is 51 or 52. And anybody who goes into menopause, meaning they go 12 months without a period, after the age of 45 is kind of considered average. That's considered normal. If you experience menopause, or for any reason you have, chemotherapy, for example, or you have surgery and removes your ovaries, anything that causes menopause to enter your world between the ages of 40 and 45 is early, but anything before the age of 40 is considered premature, or very early, and not what we would expect. And I think the stats are around 1% of people go through that spontaneously, or, kind of without cause. And it can be very life disrupting because it's very unexpected. So, what was your experience?
So my first symptom when I first started feeling not quite right, and it's hard with hormones because I think it can be so non-specific that many people can be feeling terrible because of what's going on hormonally, and we don't even have the language for it. Can't really measure what's going on. Mm-hmm. So at the time, I think I approached it as psychological. I was thinking, am I depressed? I thought I had an eating disorder. I kind of did develop an eating disorder. So when I was 26 was when I noticed that my eating started going awry. So for the first time in my life, I decided to try and lose a bit of weight, a small amount of weight. I was already slim. I wasn't particularly stressed about it, but I noticed I'd gained a couple of pounds. So for a couple of weeks, I did that whole cliched thing of I just tried to eat a little bit less, and I lost a couple of pounds, didn't think anything of it. And then a few days after that, I remember I went on a holiday, and it was an all-inclusive holiday, and I could not stop eating. And I mean, I would get up in the morning for breakfast, and I would eat a full hot cooked breakfast, followed by about 7 or 8 croissants, and I would feel so full. And yet at the same time as I was feeling so full, I was thinking about lunch. And I remember thinking how strange it was. I wasn't even distressed by it to begin with. I just thought, I'm on holiday and this is just an all-inclusive thing. But when I came back, it continued. And I would say for the next 9 months after that, my binging was at its worst. I was up at 3 o'clock in the morning, eating. I would have gone to bed at 11 p.m. full. And all I can say is that I just never felt satisfied no matter what I ate. And I thought I was losing my mind. And I remember at the time, a couple of people in my life said, do you think this might be physical? But having never experienced anything like this, I remember thinking that was just bizarre. I'm the only one who controls what food goes in my mouth. And I was talking to everybody about it at the time. Everybody, I was saying, I don't know what's going on with my appetite. And about a year into it, this woman at work said to me, have you tried coming off the contraceptive pill? Because that can affect your appetite. So I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. I stopped taking the contraceptive pill, and then 6 months went by and my menstruation didn't start. So that was when I took myself to the GP to see if I could find out what was going on. And at this point, my binge eating had tipped over into bulimia because I was trying to halt this weight gain that was happening very rapidly. And they did a blood test. And I remember when I went back to the GP for the blood results, she opened them up on the computer. And I remember she did a bit of a double take, a surprise. And she said to me, your prolactin is low. And I'd never even heard of the word prolactin. I don't know if you want to say for listeners like what prolactin is. But it's my understanding of it is a hormone that tends to be higher in females, and its main function as we know it is for breastfeeding. So if you have a child, your prolactin would go up and then you would produce milk. But men have it too. So I'm not convinced that there's no other functions around it or interact with other hormones which could make it, relevant. So they did a few more blood tests and they sent me to an endocrinologist, which was when the investigation started. So they started off by doing a scan of my womb and everything looked fine there. So then they did the brain scan. And the reason why, when everything looked fine, sort of gynecologically, they did the brain scan because they wanted to look at my pituitary gland, which is where the master gland, if you like, that controls all the hormone levels in the body. And it was in the MRI brain scan that they saw I had a tumor. They call it an adenoma because we now know it's benign. At the time, we didn't know if it was going to be benign. So they found a tumor on my pituitary gland that's about nearly 2 centimeters across, above my pituitary gland, also pushing up into my hypothalamus. So my endocrinologist theorized that this could be a hypothalamic symptom, my excessive appetite, because our appetite is regulated in the hypothalamus. But also in doing my own research, I then find out how low estrogen makes appetite go higher. My thyroid levels were low, so my energy was terrible. That was increasing my appetite. So it felt like this perfect storm, which the biggest symptom I noticed was around appetite, but I was feeling terrible as well. But I thought I was feeling terrible because of how much I was eating. But actually, I think maybe I was eating as much as I was because I was feeling terrible.
Yeah, it is a two-way street, right? I mean, it's like chicken and the egg, which comes first. But when you're in, when symptoms are caused by hormones, I think one of the things that it's very easy to get caught up in the idea that like estrogen is an ovarian hormone and only impacts your ovaries. Thyroid is a thyroid hormone, and to really have this like reductionistic view of hormones, but especially when we're talking about estrogen in particular, it is also a brain hormone. And of course, it is going to have an impact on everything from mood to sleep and reproduction and appetite. And we can't take that, reductionistic view of anything, but especially hormones.
Yeah. And this was the weird thing that I still don't really understand to this day, but it's just what happened. They started me off with giving me oral progesterone. And when I started taking the oral progesterone for 3.5 weeks, for the first time in about a year, I didn't feel the urge to compulsively eat. My appetite felt normal for the first time in a year. So I was over the moon because I thought, here's my answer. Everything's going to be fine now. And then for whatever reason, after about 3.5 weeks, I had a massive binge and then felt like I tumbled back into it. And then maybe a couple of months after that, they started me on thyroid medication. And a similar thing happened for about 3 weeks. My appetite felt normal. And then the binging came back. So I don't know if it was like a placebo thing. I don't know if it was just like the body's biochemistry is changing, so there's something sort of resetting itself. I have absolutely no idea, even to this day, really how to understand that it had that much impact when they started replacing my hormones.
Wow. So you're diagnosed
Hmm.
and, they start to treat things. How did that change? What happened next?
Well, one thing I just want to comment on as well around the hormones is I think that my hormones changing as much as they did in such a short space of time really changed my personality. I
Mm.
I remember people started talking about me as they called me nice. I know this sounds crazy. It wasn't that I wasn't nice before. I remember people telling me how calm I seemed. And I was always someone who had a lot of energy. I was the one that, everyone wants to go to bed at 3 a.m. And I'm like, no, we don't need sleep. And I'd be up at 9 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning on holidays and stuff. And all of that this energy level dropped. But at the same time, it was almost like, I sometimes joke, it's a little bit like when you have an animal and you get the animal neutered and it kind of like, just like curbs something in their hyperactivity. So there was that. I look back at who I was before my hormones changed, and I can't imagine being a therapist, that version of myself. I think it made me more empathic just to suffering in general. Going through something like that, I think changes you anyway. Um,
For
so
sure. And
yeah.
I think that that's actually really interesting because when we talk about, you know, we, if you Google or if you're on social media, all you'll see is a long list of terrible, awful things that happen in menopause and all the things that you should dread and, life is going to be terrible and all that kind of stuff. But I have said and will continue to say that I love being postmenopausal. And one of the reasons is that I also feel like there have been many benefits to my mental and emotional health by not having this cyclical roller coaster of hormones and the subsequent changes in likely neurotransmitter levels and all that kind of stuff. So, in terms of like my mental and emotional health, postmenopause has been the best 3 years of my life.
Hmm.
And I think we need to talk about that more because hormones can have lots of positive benefits. And, the saying, you'll miss estrogen when she's gone. I don't really miss her that much because she wasn't always great for me all the time.
Hmm.
So that's really interesting that you noticed that too.
Yeah. I think it's not that I don't like who I was before, but I think as I've grown and changed, and my priorities in life have changed because of this. Because I was all about, up until this happened, for me, life was about working hard and partying hard. And I was having a great time, but I wasn't really thinking about anybody else. And I don't know how
Yeah.
meaningful my connections were. I had great friends and people I'm still friends with today. But I would say a lot of the friendships that I have now that I've made kind of post this experience have been some of the most satisfying friendships in my life. But so they replaced the HRT, originally orally, and then the
Hmm.
thyroxine. And then I was noticing I was still really struggling with my mood. They wouldn't give me my growth hormone replacement until after they'd done surgery. They wanted to do a biopsy to make sure that the tumor was benign. And if you take growth hormone and you've got a cancerous tumor, then it's not likely to have that much
Yeah.
impact, but it could speed up the malignancy. So after the surgery, they put me on growth hormone. And I would say growth hormone actually was the hormone that really, it took away the very, very intense primal hunger. But I was still binging. And I was still binging because I'd gained so much weight. And I was constantly trying to get back to how I was before. Kept thinking I needed to get back to. So my binging continued, but I think I think the hormones influenced it a bit, but a little bit more psychological, a little bit more emotional, and a little
Mm.
bit more because I'm trying to restrict my food intake, which was triggering binges. So it had a slightly different flavor, I would say. I did actually go on testosterone once. I don't know if you work with many women who take
Yeah,
testosterone
sometimes. I mean,
in.
testosterone is like, it's growing in popularity. It definitely is actively being researched. I don't think we know everything there is to know about it yet, but
Mm,
it's interesting what's out
mm.
there.
So I tried it for about 6 months and I really did feel great. And for the first time,
Mhm.
I was in my eating disorder at the time, so it wasn't great for me in that aspect. But for the first time, I lost weight, so I was extremely excited about that at the time too. But it gave me really bad breakout on my skin. I used to have really good
Mm.
skin, and it's never actually gone back to how it was before,
Hmm.
even though I stopped taking it now. Gosh, 8, 9, maybe even 10 years ago. I haven't
Wow.
done the maths, a long time ago, but it really affected me and also gave me a lot of extra facial hair as well. So I didn't want any of those symptoms too. So I stopped taking the testosterone, even though it did make me feel pretty good. More
Interesting.
recently, because go on, Jeff. We're going to say something.
I was gonna, can we back up 1 second? Because
Yeah.
something that you said earlier was that you real like the binging was still happening, and that it was because you were trying to control what you were eating, which we know is a big trigger for binge eating and binge eating behaviors. Did you know it at the time? Did you know that at the
No,
time?
no. I was so black and white in my thinking because for me, I really saw my weight as the problem. So I couldn't
Mhm.
imagine recovering from binging without losing weight because that like for me losing weight was recovery from binge eating. I don't think I really got it into my head that there was a behavior here that needed to be addressed with, like, independently of trying to chase any kind of weight loss. I did start to hear the
Yeah.
message about it, and I remember originally doubting it because I wasn't somebody who was particularly good at dieting. Some people have eating disorders, go through patches where they can really double down on the dieting. I never could. So I always felt like that talk about restricting and binging didn't really apply to me until I heard about the concept of Last Supper eating from the Intuitive Eating book,
Hmm.
which of course is this
Yeah.
idea that, okay, tomorrow it's going to look like this perfect version of food. And tomorrow comes, and then the minute I felt like I'd blown it, it was like, tomorrow it's going to be. And then you binge because it's like, I need to get all the food in today. This is my last supper eating because I'm not going to have them again after today. And you really convince yourself of that each time. And I could get in these patterns of last supper eating a lot. And then I do think another layer to it was food did then start to become a way to cope. It hadn't
Yeah.
previously. I didn't have an emotional relationship with food previously, but I think when you struggled with food in a disordered eating way, it becomes this very emotional object because how you feel about yourself is like, how well am I eating? And as soon as you start getting
Yeah.
into that territory, fighting, craving, resisting, relief when you binge, all of that gets your emotions tied up in it. So then there was some emotional
Yeah,
eating as well.
absolutely.
So it was a bit of
And
a
it's so
muddle of everything.
hard, I think, for, what you said about how I thought that weight loss was going to free me from binge eating, that
Mm-hmm.
you really believe that you had to lose weight first before you could even consider working on the binge eating. That is the default for most people. You know
Mm-hmm.
that, but I'm kind
Yeah.
of saying that just to point it out that, like, most people really believe that they are the problem and their body is the problem. They and sometimes it's completely new information. I know there will be people listening to this podcast that for the first time are hearing that it's the behavior of restriction that is what, that's what we need to work on, and that changing your body will not change the binging because food isn't the problem, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And restriction and even planning to restrict. I think that's the one that doesn't necessarily get the airtime. And I sometimes think of it as if you're
Yeah,
going on a big holiday tomorrow, you think about it today, you can feel that excitement in your body. Your biology reacts in anticipation of that. And I think
absolutely.
it could be similar with food. You can be planning this all the time, never quite meeting it. And that can trigger off more overeating here. But it's hard. It's a really tough ask for people to say, hey, don't focus on weight loss, because people might want weight loss for all kinds of reasons. And I tend to think most of the time, the people who are able to let go of it in recovery usually happens for one or two reasons. Either one, which was mine, I realized and when I say realize, I saw it in myself, how the pattern of trying to lose weight was causing me to eat even more. So I got to a point
Hmm.
where I was like, oh, I see how this is going to have the opposite effect. I'm going to keep gaining and gaining. And at what point do I accept and go like, okay, fine, I'll stay where I am? So that's one. And then the other one might be simply because it's hurting too much to keep trying. So some people might be able to like maintain or suppress their weight, hold it in a certain range, but the cost of it um, just becomes too high because maybe it's all they can think about. Maybe they're extremely anxious and guilty about food all the time, whatever it might be. And I think it's the biggest
Yeah,
sticking point for most people for binge eating recovery is that it feels impossible to let go of.
absolutely.
Mm.
Absolutely. And something else that you said about Last Supper eating, I think that is an easily recognizable pattern. Sometimes the first pattern I think that people see themselves in. And what I really realized is that it also has convinces us that we can store up satisfaction. That if I eat all of these things today, that I can store up enough satisfaction in the process of eating them to never have them again or to never want them again.
Mm-hmm.
And satisfaction, which I love, I call the secret sauce, it is, but it's in the moment. You can't store it up. You can't like save some for tomorrow because it really is like a subjective thing that you experience while you're doing it. And that this Last Supper eating keeps pushing the ceiling up of like a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. But it just doesn't work that way. Which is why I think intuitive eating's kind of like unconditional permission can really help people get out of that last meal mentality, because it doesn't exist in a world where there's unconditional permission, because there never is a last meal.
Yeah.
But I love that you brought up the last meal mentality, because that's a really recognizable place for people, I think, who might be listening and thinking, oh gosh, this sounds like me. How do I know? So then all of this is the catalyst is happening, right? So, so what's the next step in this reaction?
Okay. So in 2010, that's when I had the surgery on the pituitary tumor. And it's also the same year that my mum died. And I was extremely close to my mum. She was an incredible source of support. So 2010, and I had a pretty rough time during the surgery as well. I was ill for quite a while. Was a really, really tough year. So 2011, I would say, was actually the darkest year. It was the year after it was all happening. When everything's going on, you're just dealing with what's going on. But then when everything's happened, there's something about the picking up the pieces afterwards that was really difficult. Yeah. And my eating disorder was at the worst it had ever been at that point. And I was feeling so lost. And I moved, and a friend came to visit me with her dog, and we went out for a walk with her dog, and the dog stopped to do what dogs do. She's clearing it up, and I just stood there on the pavement looking around, and then I see this big sign that says metanoia, counselling and psychotherapy training. It's almost like this is the point in the movie where the lights would come on and the choirs would sing. And I remember thinking, how have I not noticed this massive training centre just around the corner from where I live? And I'd never even heard the word metanoia. It was a strange word to me. And so for whatever reason, I thought of it later and I Googled it, and they were doing an evening class in basic counselling skills. And again, not for 1 second, Jen, did I think this was the beginning of a career change. I just remember thinking, that'll get me out of the house one evening, because my life had become really small. I was just sitting in my room with my food. I just shut myself off from life. And I went to this evening course and I just fell in love with it. And so many people on the course were doing it because they were going on to train, and they were offering this master's program. At the same time as they changed the pensions for the police, which meant I was going to have to work longer, pay more, get less back. So that felt like a little nudge as well. Didn't have the whole golden handcuffs holding me in. So I decided to become a therapist at that time, not thinking, oh, I'll be the binge eating therapist. I didn't think I'd be working with binge eating. I was still struggling with an eating disorder myself. So I didn't think that would be what I would be working with. But I think it did a couple of things for me. I think one, it gave me a sense of purpose again in my life, just a sense of meaning, something that felt important, that I felt I could be good at and strive towards. And also the people who were also training to be therapists were just incredible people. I found myself having these kinds of conversations with people about ourselves and understanding ourselves that felt really connecting, which I didn't have so much with the friends in my life. And so it kind of went from there. And part of the criteria as you're training to be a therapist is to go into therapy yourself. So I was like, great, I'll go to therapy and fix myself. None of my therapists that I worked with knew anything about binge eating. I mean, some of the things they were suggesting were just absurd, and I know to certain people would have been actively harmful, but they didn't know. It was just kind of in ignorance. But it really did help me understand myself quite a bit. And so there were lots of different pieces that kind of came in that helped me get into a balance with food. And when I changed the goalpost to I need to figure out how to regulate my appetite, not figure out how to lose weight, that made a big difference. After my surgery, they damaged my pituitary gland a bit further, and I lost another hormone. I lost my antidiuretic hormone. So I now have to manage my own fluid levels
Oh my
artificially by
gosh.
taking an antidiuretic. And then most recently, just November, actually, so a year ago now, I had the coil fitted, the progesterone coil, because I've been
Yep.
taking oral progesterone since I was diagnosed back at 27, whenever it was. And I thought to myself, 27 to 42, that's 15 years of putting this hormone through my digestive tract every day. Not every day, 12 to 14, 12 days of the month, I think I took it. I found it also really affected my mood and my sleep. I didn't particularly get on with it. So I thought I'll try the coil because obviously the progesterone is then being locally delivered. And I used to have horrendously heavy, painful periods. The coil's taken some time to settle down, but interesting what you were saying earlier, Jen, about feeling so much better about you, feeling so much better in general because you're not having to deal with these cycles. I would say since being on the coil, I feel this menstrual cycle and I have a couple of really difficult days mood-wise. Really difficult days because I'm
That's
having
great though.
something of a cycle. Yeah.
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 Yeah. I mean, I think that, you have a really interesting experience of having this major hormonal disruption in your late 20s that was really a brain problem. So not because you were running out of eggs, but obviously the brain impacts how the reproductive system works. So it was causing this menopause like picture,
Mm-hmm.
right? And obviously you've continued to have a lot of hormonal changes, but it's been a roller coaster for you.
Mm-hmm.
Really, like, I can't imagine how, I mean, I just can't imagine what that's like. So how does it feel now that you're in the normal age range for when people might be starting to experience things? Because it must have been fairly isolating to be in your late 20s, early 30s and going through all of these major hormonal changes in ways that most people don't.
Well, it's funny because during that time I was just obsessed with the food. So
Mm,
I wasn't particularly, certainly wasn't even thinking of the word menopause. I knew these hormones had been knocked out, but it wasn't probably until later on when I heard other people talking about, oh, wait till you get to menopause or something like that. And I would say, well, I'm guessing I won't have one because in theory, I've already gone through it. I'm not going to go through some kind of, I guess, up and down. And I think because it happened to me so young and so, clearly, if you like, I was really
yeah,
well looked after, and I've had incredible treatment from doctors,
that's
surgeons,
wonderful.
everybody who's looked after me in this condition, with this condition, has been absolutely amazing. I guess now at 42, there's a little question in my mind. I remember when you came on our podcast, I think, was it you who said that your grandmother or your mother at 45 went
Both
into
my mom and
menopause
my
and didn't?
grandmother were menopausal by 45, and I was 44. So,
Yeah, because part of me is thinking, gosh, when can I come off this HRT? Because I've been on it really because I'm thinking about bone
mm,
health. If my estrogen was
yes.
wiped out in my 20s and they're offering me this, they're saying this is good for my health and I need to take it. But really, I would love to just come off of HRT. But I'm like, when is the sensible time to do it? And that's going to probably be quite a rational, just thought out decision. But I don't even know how to make that decision at what point. Because my endocrinologist has been great, as in she's often will go with my wishes. Sometimes I'll be like, can we try tweaking this a bit? Can we try tweaking that? My estrogen, I've been on everything from 75, the patches, 75 patches, up to 200 and down. And
Wow.
whenever they were doing my blood, sometimes it would be high, sometimes it would be low. And I'm not convinced that, I don't know if it's my skin, is even
Mm.
absorbing the estrogen in a very consistent, like leveled out way. So I feel like there have been, well, I've seen in my blood test, there have been these spikes. So that we're forever tweaking my
Wow.
estrogen. It goes high and it goes low. And it's like, I don't even know why that would be, considering I'm not making my own.
Yeah, and it's a great question. I mean, the standard guidelines for premature ovarian insufficiency are to continue hormone therapy until the average age of menopause, so kind of 51, 52. But I certainly know many people who continue it beyond that, for reasons that they discuss and feel like there are benefits. But it is a bit of a line in the sand. You kind of just say, like, well, this is once you reach that age, theoretically you should be kind of back in the like average group, and really be um being able to evaluate risks alongside kind of age-related peers, and not as someone who was kind of in the outlier group for most of it. So,
Yeah.
but it's a great question.
Yeah.
So what do you
That's
feel like now that you're doing what you do, and what you've learned, what would you say to somebody what do you wish you had known? What would you say to your younger self who was going through that again? Somebody who's listening who might think, oh my gosh, this is me. Or like,
mhm.
what do you wish you had known about all of it? Either the binge eating, the eating disorders, the menopause, like what would have helped you to have an easier time?
Well, I'm not sure I would have been able to have heard it at the time, but I guess what
Mm.
I'm thinking of, what came to mind when you were speaking then, was actually how much peace, mental and emotional peace, there can be in acceptance, even if it's not how you would want it to be. For the longest time, I was fighting myself, I was fighting my body, I was fighting my health conditions, everything. It just felt like this constant state of resistance. It wasn't like pity, but it was just, I couldn't accept that I can't completely control my appetite. So I spent years trying to prove that wrong, when actually that was a battle I was never going to win. So at the point when I was like, hang on a second, I really have to work with this appetite rather than against it. And the same with like the hormones as well. I need to work with this. So one thing, my energy levels really changed after this. And so now, again, maybe because I'm coming into the average, it seems like a lot of my friends are just as tired as I am. But I think in my 30s, I might have been struggling with my energy more than my peers were. And that was really hard for me because it felt like part of my personality, how energetic I was as well. So I think there's something
Yeah,
lovely in that, and kind of growing into that and allowing that slowing down of that kind of
I love it.
energy and meaning, like how finding other meaning. I think so much of my meaning before was just in how other people thought about me or viewed me. I was chasing admiration, I was chasing approval, but in a very there are people who might chase approval through people pleasing. I think I chased it through trying to somehow be superior. And I don't like that piece. Like I look at her and I'm like, I have compassion for her. I know why she was like that, but it was about, I need to feel okay by if I compare myself to others, and I can compare myself more favorably. And that I realize how disconnecting that is. Whether you put yourself
Yeah,
above or below somebody, you're disconnected. So I've learned a lot about connection, I
very
think, as
true.
well, which is just lovely. To me, connection is what makes me feel safe in the world, because we're all living in our own minds and our own bodies.
Absolutely.
No one else is there. It's just us here. So it's important.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insights, because I found it really interesting to hear how you connected the dots and how that has informed the work that you do. Before I ask the last question, if people want to learn more about you, where's the best place for them to go?
So I have a YouTube channel, which is probably where I'm most active, and that's called The Binge Eating Therapist. So you can find me on YouTube. My website is also thebingeeatingtherapist.com. And I too have a podcast, which Jen has been on. You could come over to our podcast and listen to Jen's episode. It's the Life After Diets podcast that I co-host with Stephanie Michelle, who's also been on this podcast.
I know
We're
we're
all
having like
friends.
this little exchange. It's great. But I mean, that really speaks to, I think, how we have a very common and shared message for people around their relationship with food and their body. And I think the work that you're doing is great. So thank you for sharing your work. Thank you for sharing your story. And now for the last question. What would you say is the missing ingredient in midlife? Now that you actually could technically say you're midlife, now that you're
Yeah.
42, what would you say is the missing ingredient?
For me, and it might be similar to my previous answer, but it's your values, finding your values. Because we grow up in these
Yes.
families and in this culture where we have these values thrust upon us. And you're very welcome to take on those values as your own, but most of us do it without thinking, without critical thought. So really stopping and for me, really shifting my values has completely changed even just how I feel about being in my midlife now. So yeah,
I
something
love
about being
that.
value-led by your own values that you have chosen, consciously chosen. I want this to be what is valuable to me in my life, and this is how I'm going to try and live life.
I love it. That's perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. We will put links to all the things in the show notes, and I really appreciate you being here today.
Thank you, Jen.